You gonna cry, old lady?
She didn't answer. She never answered the first taunt. That was the discipline. You let a threat show you its whole hand before you decided how much of yours it deserved to see.
I said you gonna cry?
The boy, who said it was maybe 22, broad through the shoulders, a fresh tattoo, still pink at the edges on his forearm. 4 others stood behind him in a loose crescent, phones already up, already filming, already certain of how this story would end. She sat very still on the bus depot bench with her hands folded over the head of a plain wooden cane she did not need for walking. 62 years old. Gray hair cropped high and tight the way it had been cropped for 40 years. A denim jacket with no patches, no insignia, nothing that said what she had been.
Boys,
She said finally, and her voice was quiet, almost gentle.
you have exactly one good choice left in this conversation, and it's walking away from it. I'd take it if I were you.
The boy in front laughed, and behind him, 4 phones kept recording, hungry for whatever came next. None of them knew what they were standing in front of. None of them knew about the promise she'd made in a field hospital outside Kandahar 14 years ago to a 20-year-old private who never got to go home. None of them knew that the woman on the bench had once been Command Sergeant Major Rosalind Roz Calloway, United States Army, and that the hands folded so calmly over that cane had trained 600 soldiers in close-quarters combatives and had once, on the worst night of her career, made a choice that she'd sworn, to a dying boy, to herself, to God, she would never have to make again. They were about to make her break that promise, and in the next 11 minutes, they were going to learn exactly what happens when the quietest person in the room turns out to be the most dangerous one who ever lived in it. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your country or city in the comments. I read every single one. And if stories of courage, sacrifice, and unforgettable moments like this move you, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story. The town was called Miller's Fork, population 9,000 and shrinking, the kind of place where the biggest building was the feed co-op and the second biggest was the church. Roz Calloway had moved there 4 years earlier because it was close enough to the VA hospital in the county seat and far enough from anywhere she'd have to explain herself to anyone. She liked it that way. 3 mornings a week, she caught the 8:15 bus into town to volunteer at the community garden the VA ran for veterans, working through what the pamphlets called reintegration. She never called it that. She called it digging in the dirt with people who understood silence. The depot was nothing more than a covered bench and a schedule board with a bus that came twice a day. Roz always sat on the far end, back to the wall, eyes on the road. An old habit that had outlived every reason she'd ever had for it, the way old habits do. That was where Dallas Whitfield found her. Dallas was 22 years old and the only son of Garrett Whitfield, who owned half the county in one way or another. The feed co-op, 3 rental properties, a seat on the county commission he'd bought the old-fashioned way, with money and favors. Dallas had grown up hearing the words, "my father," work like a key that opened every door that ever tried to stay shut on him. He had never once, in 22 years, been told no by anyone whose no actually mattered. He came around the corner of the depot with 4 friends trailing him: Cody, Trent, Big Mike, and a nervous 19-year-old named Petey, who'd tagged along because Dallas's crew was the only crew that had ever asked him along to anything. And they were loud with the particular boredom of young men who had nowhere they needed to be, and no one who would ever make them account for wherever they ended up instead. "Well, look at this," Dallas said, dropping onto the bench across from her uninvited, close enough that his knee nearly touched hers. "Grandma's got a bus to catch." Roz didn't move. "I do," she said. "In about 40 minutes. 40 minutes is a long time to sit here all by yourself." Dallas smiled the particular smile of a boy who has never once had to wonder if a room might not be his. "We'll keep you company." This was the first thing they didn't know. Roz Calloway had spent 19 years reading rooms for a living, reading the half-second before a soldier's hand moved to a weapon, the half-inch of shift in a stranger's stance that told you everything about what came next. She read this one in under 3 seconds. Bored, untested, cruel in the specific, casual way of someone who'd never had cruelty answered. Here was the second thing. 4 years before that morning, in a debrief room at Fort Bragg, a 2-star general had told her that her combatives program had produced some of the most technically precise close-quarters instructors the Army had fielded in a decade, and that she was, without exaggeration, one of the most dangerous hand-to-hand practitioners still wearing a uniform. She had thanked him and gone home and never told a soul in Miller's Fork. And here was the third thing, the one that mattered most. Roz Calloway had sworn, 14 years earlier, at the bedside of a soldier who did not survive the night, that she would never again let her hands be the last thing standing between a bad decision and a body on the ground, not without exhausting every single door out first. She was about to offer these boys every one of those doors. They were about to slam every single one shut. To understand what happened next, you have to go back 14 years, to a forward operating base outside Kandahar, to a private first class named Danny Ochoa, who was 20 years old and terrified and good at his job anyway. Roz was his platoon sergeant. It was her job to bring boys like Danny home in one piece, and for 2 tours she had done exactly that, with a discipline that other NCOs studied and tried to copy. A discipline built on a simple, unglamorous rule she drilled into every soldier under her. Control comes before force. Every single time. No exceptions. Not even when it's slower. Not even when it costs you. On a resupply run that went wrong in a market outside a checkpoint, a local man Danny had flagged as suspicious lunged at him with a knife hidden in a bread sack. Danny hesitated. 1 half-second of hesitation, the natural half-second of a 20-year-old who did not yet trust his own instincts, and it was Roz, 6 feet away, who closed the gap. She disarmed the man in under 2 seconds using a wrist lock and a controlled takedown she had taught 100 times, and no one was killed, and the checkpoint held, and it should have ended there. It did not end there. Because that night, in a mortar strike no one saw coming, Danny Ochoa died in a field hospital with Roz Calloway holding his hand, and the last thing he said to her, through morphine, through fear, through a body that already knew it was leaving, was, "Sergeant, did I freeze because I'm weak?" She told him no. She told him hesitation wasn't weakness, that control was the hardest skill in the world to build, and he'd been building it exactly right. She told him he'd done everything correctly, and the mortar had nothing to do with him, and it was true, and none of it mattered, because he died anyway, at 20 years old, believing for a few terrible seconds that he'd failed. Roz made a promise to him that night, the kind of promise a person makes when grief needs somewhere to go. She promised that for the rest of her life, she would use her hands only in defense of someone weaker, only after every other door had been tried, and only with the precision to control, never to punish. Danny had died doubting his own control. She would spend the rest of her days proving that control, used correctly, was the whole point. "My hands are for holding the line," she told his memory, "not for crossing it." She retired 6 years later, a command sergeant major with a silver star from an earlier deployment she never discussed, a bronze star with V device, and a combatives manual with her name quietly credited in the appendix that soldiers all over the Army still trained from without knowing who'd written it. She had not raised a hand in anger in 14 years. She had also not stopped training, not once. Every morning at 5 a.m., in the small converted shed behind her house, she worked a heavy bag until her old knuckles ached, because a promise to control your power is not the same as a promise to let it go soft. Danny Ochoa's memory deserved a woman who stayed dangerous and chose, every single day, not to be. That was the discipline sitting on the bench at the Miller's Fork Depot when Dallas Whitfield's knee touched hers. She had exhausted this kind of situation 100 small times since retirement. A rude clerk, a tailgater, a man at the VA who'd once grabbed her arm too hard. Every time, she'd held the door shut and walked away. And every time it had cost her something quiet and internal that no one but her ever saw. This time, the door would not hold. "You're sitting kind of close," Roz said, and shifted 6 inches down the bench, unhurried, the way you'd correct a soldier's stance without raising your voice. Dallas closed the gap again. "I like it here." Cody laughed. Big Mike laughed. Trent had his phone up now, angled low so it looked casual, the way you film something you already know is going to be worth something. "This is our stop," Dallas said. "Whole town's kind of ours, actually. My daddy owns half the buildings on this street. You believe that? Half." "I believe you," Roz said. "I'd still like my 6 inches back." "Feisty," Dallas said, delighted, and reached out and flicked the brim of her ball cap off her head into the dirt. Roz did not move to pick it up. She looked at him with an expression that had once made 20-year-old privates go quiet mid-sentence, and she said, evenly, "Son, I am going to say this to you exactly once, and I want you to hear all of it. I have no interest in trouble with you. I would like you to walk away from this bench right now, go find something better to do with your morning, and we will both forget this happened. That is the best outcome available to you today. I promise you that. Warning 1. Dallas looked back at his friends, grinning, and picked her hat up out of the dirt himself, and put it on his own head, backward, mocking. "Or what, Grandma?" Petey, at the edge of the group, had stopped laughing. Something in the old woman's stillness had started to bother him in a way he couldn't name yet. Roz looked at the boy wearing her hat, and something in her chest went very quiet and very still. The specific, dangerous quiet she hadn't felt in 14 years. "Second time," she said. "Walk away, all of you, right now. You do not want to find out what happens if you don't, and I promise you, I don't want you to find out either." Dallas leaned in close enough that she could smell the beer already on him at 9 in the morning. "Make me," he said. She was about to. And 40 feet away, unnoticed by any of them, an old man in a VFW cap sitting on the curb outside the feed co-op had stopped mid-sip of his coffee, squinting at the woman on the bench with the beginning of a memory he couldn't yet place. A memory that would, in about 6 minutes, turn a viral video into a legend. Here is what almost none of the men standing around that bench understood, and what the phones recording them were about to prove to the entire country. Roz Calloway had spent 19 years learning that violence deferred is not violence avoided. It is violence postponed, and stacked, and left to compound in a body that has been trained since it was 17 years old to be an instrument of exactly one purpose. She had given 2 warnings. Army doctrine on escalation of force, the same doctrine she'd taught to checkpoint guards in 2 different countries, called for a clear, final opportunity before action. Not for the enemy's sake, for her own conscience. She stood up from the bench. "Last chance," she said, and her voice had dropped a register, gone flat and quiet, in a way that made even Cody stop laughing. "I am asking you, as directly and as kindly as I know how, to let this go. Go home. Live good lives. I will not ask a 4th time." Dallas Whitfield looked at the small, gray-haired woman standing in front of 5 much larger men, and he made the single worst decision of his young life. He shoved her. Not hard. A showman's shove. A shove for the camera. 2 hands flat against her collarbone, enough to make her stumble back a step for the video. It was meant to be funny. It was meant to be nothing. Roz Calloway did not stumble. She caught herself in a half-step so small and so controlled that 4 of the 5 boys standing there didn't register it as anything at all. But Trent, still filming, would later swear on the stand that in the half-second after that shove, something in the old woman's whole body changed, like a switch closing somewhere he couldn't see. That, Roz said quietly, was assault, and it was the last one I'm going to let go without an answer." Dallas laughed, nervous now, though he wouldn't have admitted it, and reached behind his back. The knife came out slow, almost lazy, a folding blade he'd carried since he was 16 and never once needed. He flicked it open with a practiced little flourish meant to be intimidating and pointed it loosely in her direction, more prop than threat, the way a boy points a thing he doesn't understand the weight of. "Make me," he said again, grinning at his own camera. Roz Calloway looked at the blade. She looked at the 4 boys behind it, filming, laughing, certain. She looked, for 1/2 of 1 second, at nothing at all. At a field hospital 14 years and 7,000 miles away. At a boy's hand going slack in hers. And then Command Sergeant Major Rosalind Calloway, United States Army retired, closed her eyes for exactly 1 breath and said, so softly that only Dallas heard it over his own laughter, "I'm sorry, Danny." Her eyes opened. Her hand moved. What happened next took 11 seconds, and Trent's phone caught every frame of it, and by the following night, more than 40 million people would have watched it, and every single one of them would agree, across every argument that normally divided them, that they had never seen anything like it before. The knife came first, because the knife was the only thing that could actually kill her, and 19 years of disarm training does not evaporate in retirement. It settles into the body the way a language settles, waiting. Her left hand closed on Dallas's wrist in a controlled wrist lock she had drilled into 600 soldiers, rotating with her whole hip instead of just her arm, the way she'd corrected 1,000 students for failing to do. And the blade dropped into the dirt before Dallas even understood his hand was empty. Her right hand did not throw a punch. That surprised the boxing-trained men who broke the tape down frame by frame in the days that followed, expecting a knockout blow and finding something stranger and more precise. A short, economical strike with the heel of her palm to the base of Dallas's sternum, textbook enough to have come straight out of the Army's own combatives manual. Enough force to drop the wind out of him and put him on his knees in the dirt, gasping, nowhere near enough to break a rib. Cody came at her from the side with a wild swing, and Roz was simply not where the swing arrived, a half step of footwork so economical it looked, on the video, like she'd read his mind 3 seconds before he'd made the decision himself. A single counter to the outside of his knee, a controlled takedown, not a strike, put him on the ground without a mark on him. Big Mike grabbed for her from behind, and this was the one moment even Roz would later admit had genuinely frightened her, because Big Mike outweighed her by 110 pounds and had the kind of grip that could actually do damage. But a rear bear hug escape was one of the first things she'd ever taught a checkpoint guard, and her elbow found the soft cartilage under his ribs with exactly the amount of force required, and not an ounce more, and he folded, wheezing, into the dirt. Trent, filming with one hand, took a swing with the other, and got a controlled wrist lock and a takedown that put him face down in the gravel so gently that he would later, in his own statement to police, describe it as, "like she set me down." 4 men, 11 seconds, not one broken bone among them. And Petey, 19 years old, the one who'd only ever tagged along, the one who'd never once wanted any of this, stood frozen at the edge of it all, with his hands half raised and tears already on his face, having not thrown a single punch, having not moved at all, watching a small gray-haired woman dismantle 4 grown men with a precision that looked less like violence and more like a language he didn't have the vocabulary for. Roz Calloway stood in the center of 4 groaning young men, breathing hard, her hands trembling, not from exertion, but from something else entirely. And she looked, for one unguarded moment on camera, less like a warrior and more like a woman who had just done the one thing she'd promised a dying boy she would never have to do again. "I'm sorry," she said, to no one in the crowd could quite place. "I'm so sorry." And that was the moment the old man in the VFW cap, coffee forgotten on the ground beside him, finally placed the memory that had been nagging him for 6 minutes. The face, the bearing, a photograph he'd seen once in a Stars and Stripes article a decade ago about the woman who rewrote the Army's close-quarters training doctrine. And he started walking toward the depot as fast as his knees would let him, already shouting the name that was about to turn a viral video into a legend. "That's Calloway," he was yelling, to anyone who'd listen, to no one in particular, to the whole gathering crowd. "Sweet Lord, that's Command Sergeant Major Calloway." The first cruiser arrived 4 minutes later, and for a dangerous handful of seconds, the story nearly went the way these stories have gone 1,000 times before, in 1,000 small towns. Deputy Wade Ferris was 26 years old, 2 years on the job, and what he saw when he came around the depot wall was this: 4 grown men down in the dirt, groaning, and one gray-haired woman standing over them, breathing hard, hands still open at her sides. His hand went to his belt before his brain had finished processing anything else. "Ma'am, I need you to get on the ground. Hands behind your deputy." The voice that cut him off wasn't Roz's. It belonged to the old man in the VFW cap, out of breath from his half-jog across the lot, one hand raised like he was stopping traffic. "Deputy, hold on 1 second. Sir, step back. I fought 2 tours," the old man said, "and I am telling you, before you do something you cannot undo, you need to look at that knife in the dirt before you look at anything else." Ferris looked. The folding blade lay 6 feet from Dallas Whitfield, who was still on his knees, still fighting for breath. Trent, on the ground nearby, was already holding his phone up toward the deputy without being asked, the footage still open on the screen. It should not have been a hard decision. It should not have taken a stranger yelling and a phone shoved into his hands for a trained officer to ask the right first question, instead of reaching for his cuffs. But it is worth saying plainly, because it is the honest and uncomfortable truth of how these mornings sometimes go. A 26-year-old deputy very nearly cuffed a 62-year-old retired command sergeant major for defending her own life, on the strength of nothing but who was standing and who was on the ground. To Wade Ferris's lasting credit, he stopped. He crouched down, gloved the knife into an evidence bag with his own hands, and took Trent's phone number before anyone thought to suggest the video disappear. He radioed for 2 more units and an ambulance, more out of procedure than urgency. None of the 4 young men on the ground had anything worse than bruised ribs and wounded pride. And then he turned to Roz Calloway, who still hadn't moved from the spot where she'd stopped, and he said, "Quiet now, careful. Ma'am, can you tell me what happened here?" "I can," Roz said, "but I'd like you to hear it from the video first. I don't trust my own account of the last 2 minutes yet." It was, Ferris would say later in his report, the single strangest thing a suspect, or a victim, he genuinely didn't know which word applied yet, had ever said to him. He watched Trent's video standing right there in the gravel lot, and by the time it reached the 11-second mark, his hand had come off his belt entirely. That was when a truck the size of a small building came skidding into the lot, and the second half of the morning's trouble began, a kind that had nothing to do with fists. Garrett Whitfield did not go to his son first. That was the detail that would follow him for the rest of his life. The detail 3 separate witnesses gave to 3 separate reporters within 24 hours, all using nearly the same words. He stepped over Dallas, who was still on the ground, still catching his breath, blood from a split lip on his chin, without so much as a glance down, and walked straight at Deputy Ferris. "You are going to arrest that woman right now," Whitfield said. It wasn't a request. 20 years of county politics had taught Garrett Whitfield that very few requests were ever necessary when you had his last name and his checkbook. She attacked 5 boys with a deadly weapon. "I want her in cuffs before that ambulance gets here. Sir, I need you to step back. Do you know who I am? I sit on the commission that approves your department's budget. I can end your career from this parking lot, and I promise you I will. Unless that woman is in the back of your cruiser in the next 60 seconds. Roz Calloway, still standing where the fight had ended, looked at the shouting man with an expression that had nothing angry in it at all, something closer, Deputy Ferris would later say, to pity. She had spent 19 years watching what happens to young men who are raised believing that consequences are a weather system that only ever rains on other people, and she understood, with a clarity that made her chest ache, exactly which of the boys on the ground had been raised by exactly this man. She did not say anything in her own defense. She had learned a long time ago that the truth rarely needs volume. It needs someone patient enough to let it arrive at its own pace. Deputy Ferris, to his credit a second time that morning, held his ground. "Sir, I have a knife in evidence and video from 3 separate phones showing your son and 4 other individuals surrounding this woman, striking her first and displaying a weapon. I'm not arresting her. I'd strongly advise you get your son some medical attention and let me do my job." Whitfield's face went a color Ferris would describe in his report as close to purple, and he was still shouting. About lawyers, about the sheriff being a personal friend, about the deputy's badge number. When the second thing happened, the thing Garrett Whitfield had absolutely no way of knowing was already happening. 40 feet away, a woman named Marisol Vega, who ran the co-op's front register and had stepped outside on her break to see what the commotion was, had her own phone up and recording, and had been recording since the moment his truck skidded into the lot. Whitfield's video did not have 11 seconds of controlled, disciplined restraint in it. It had a father who never once knelt beside his own son, threatening a deputy on tape to bury the truth of what that son had done. By the next morning, both videos had been watched more than 60 million times combined, and something rare happened in the comment sections underneath them. For one strange, unified week, people who agreed on almost nothing else in the country agreed completely on this. Trent's video was the one that carried the weight, because Trent's video had sound. You could hear Roz Calloway give 3 clear warnings before anyone laid a hand on her. You could hear the shove and the knife click open, and the 11 controlled seconds that followed it. No wasted motion, no strike harder than it needed to be. 4 young men on the ground, and not one of them with anything worse than what a hard tackle in a high school football game might have produced. Veterans and combatives instructors broke it down frame by frame, the way boxing analysts break down championship footage, and every one of them arrived at the same conclusion. This was not a fight. This was a demonstration, performed under duress, by someone who had spent a career teaching precisely this skill, and had chosen, in the middle of the worst 2 minutes of her retirement, not to use 1 ounce more of it than the situation required. Marisol's video was the one that ended a career. It went out under headlines that all landed on some version of the same 7 words. County Commissioner threatens deputy on tape. Whitfield Feed and Supply lost 2 of its biggest contracts within the week. Not from any boycott, but from board members who'd been looking for a reason to distance themselves for years, and had finally been handed one in broad daylight. The state party that had been quietly grooming Garrett Whitfield for a run at the legislature released a statement so cold and so fast that reporters joked it must have been pre-written for exactly this occasion. Old Army records surfaced within days. A Stars and Stripes feature from a decade earlier. Official DoD photos of a much younger Command Sergeant Major Calloway standing in front of a training class at Fort Benning. An appendix credit in the Army's own Combatives Field Manual that almost no one outside the training community had ever noticed before. A journalist found the citation for her Silver Star, earned years earlier for pulling 2 wounded soldiers under fire from a collapsed structure, and Roz gave exactly 1 interview about it, in which she said almost nothing about herself and a great deal about the soldiers she'd served with, several of whom, she noted quietly, never got the chance to come home and be interviewed about anything at all. The county's Veterans Outreach Program, the community garden Roz volunteered at 3 mornings a week, which had survived for 6 years on a shoestring budget and a handful of volunteers, received more in donations in 4 days than it had in the previous 3 years combined. Roz Calloway did not enjoy a single minute of the attention. She gave interviews only when she believed they might help someone, declined every offer to write a book or sell her story, and spent most of that strange, loud week doing the only thing that made any of it bearable: showing up to the garden at 7 a.m., like always, kneeling in the dirt with a trowel, letting the noise of the world happen somewhere else for a few hours. But there was one piece of unfinished business the cameras hadn't caught, and it mattered to her more than every headline combined. It was still standing frozen at the edge of a gravel lot, 19 years old, with tears on his face and a wet stain down the front of his jeans. A boy named Petey who hadn't thrown a single punch, and who couldn't stop hearing, over and over, the sound of a woman he'd helped corner saying "I'm sorry" to someone none of them could see. Petey Alvarez walked into the county sheriff's office on his own, the morning after, before any lawyer had told him what to say, and before any deal was on the table. He was the only one of the 5 who did. Dallas Whitfield, once his father's money finally understood there was nothing left in the world it could buy its way out of, lawyered up fast and said nothing. Cody and Trent and Big Mike followed the same script, coached into silence by attorneys who had taken one look at the footage and quietly started using the word plea instead of the word defense. Petey sat across from a detective with his hands shaking in his lap and told the truth about everything. About whose idea it usually was to find someone to corner, about 2 other incidents that had never been reported, about how long it had been building before it ever reached that bench at the depot. He wasn't trying to save himself. His lawyer, appointed and exasperated, told him twice that he was volunteering information nobody had asked for and could simply stop. He didn't stop. "I keep hearing her," he told the detective when she finally asked him why. She said sorry. To us. After everything we did to her, she said she was sorry. I don't understand how a person does that. I want to understand it. Word of the confession reached the county prosecutor's office the same week the Whitfield case was being prepared for arraignment, and it reached Roz Calloway a few days after that, secondhand, from Deputy Ferris, who'd taken to stopping by the community garden on his own time now, on account of something about the whole case that he said he still hadn't fully worked through. "There's one of them," Ferris told her, leaning on the garden fence while she turned soil around a row of late tomatoes. "Who came in on his own. Wants to make it right. Best he can. Youngest one. Never touched you at all, actually. Just stood there." Roz didn't look up from the dirt for a long moment. "Petey," she said finally. "The one who cried. You remember his name?" "I remember all of them," she said. "That's the part nobody understands about a moment like that. You remember every single face." She was quiet for a while, working the trowel through the soil with the same unhurried patience she'd once used to disarm a man twice her size, and when she finally spoke again, it wasn't to Ferris. It was almost to herself, the way a person talks when they're deciding something out loud before they've fully decided it. 14 years ago, she said, a boy I was responsible for died believing he'd failed, when the truth was he'd done everything right, and the world had simply been cruel to him anyway. I've spent every day since trying to make sure that never happens to another young person on my watch, if I can help it. She looked up at Ferris, and there was something in her face that hadn't been there in the interviews, something none of the 60 million people who'd watched the video had ever gotten to see. When the prosecutor calls about that boy, and she will, because everyone always asks the person in the video what they think a young man like that deserves, I want you to tell her something for me before I say it myself. What's that, Sergeant Major? Tell her that boy looked at what he'd helped start, and it broke something loose in him that needed breaking, Roz said. Tell her I've spent my whole life watching this country decide certain young people are already lost before anyone's bothered to check. Tell her I'd like to be the one who checks. On this one, if she'll let me. There was no long trial, because in the end there was almost nothing left to argue. You cannot cross-examine 11 seconds of video watched 60 million times. You cannot cross-examine a father's own voice, on a second phone, threatening a deputy on tape. The attorneys Garrett Whitfield's money had assembled for his son took one look at the combined footage, the knife in evidence, and Petey Alvarez's voluntary statement naming 2 prior incidents, and within 3 weeks they were no longer talking about a defense. They were talking about a plea. Dallas Whitfield pleaded guilty to assault with a deadly weapon, with an enhancement the prosecutor's office applied without hesitation, given the words caught clearly on Trent's audio in the moments before the knife came out. Words about who did and didn't belong at that bench. Words that made clear exactly what kind of morning it had been for Roz Calloway before it was anything else. He was sentenced to 4 years, with the possibility of an earlier release, contingent on completing a court-ordered violence intervention program, a program that, in a detail the local paper couldn't resist printing, was modeled in part on curriculum written for military de-escalation training. Cody and Trent and Big Mike received lesser sentences, weighted by the extent of their own conduct and their cooperation, once Petey's statement made further denial pointless. All 3 served time. None of them ever spoke to Roz Calloway again, and she never asked to hear from them. Garrett Whitfield was never charged with a crime. Threatening a deputy's career is not, in itself, illegal, however ugly it looks on video. But the county commission voted him off within the month, his contracts dried up one by one, and the state party that had once measured him for higher office released a final statement so brief and so cold that even his own former allies privately admitted it read like a eulogy. He did not attend his son's sentencing. Whether that was shame or something colder, Roz never speculated. Not even once. Not even when a reporter pushed her to. "I don't know that man's heart," she told the reporter. "I know what he did in a parking lot on the worst morning of his son's life, and I know he didn't kneel down first. That's the only thing I'm willing to say I know for certain." It was, everyone agreed, exactly the kind of answer you'd expect from a woman who had spent 19 years being trained never to say more than the facts could support. The call from the prosecutor's office came on a Tuesday, in the middle of a task force meeting about restorative alternatives for the youngest defendant, and it began with a question the prosecutor had genuinely expected to spend 20 minutes talking Roz Calloway out of. "Sergeant Major, I have to ask this carefully, because it's unusual and I want to be fair to you about what it would actually involve. Given what he did to you, even if he never laid a hand on you himself, are you certain you want any part of this young man's supervision?" "I'm certain," Roz said, without a pause long enough for the prosecutor to interrupt. "Give him to me." It took 2 months to arrange, a formal agreement between the court, the Veterans Outreach nonprofit that ran the community garden, and a probation department that had never in its history signed off on anything quite like it. 18 months of supervised community service, restorative counseling, and, the part that made the local paper run the story a second time, months after the first frenzy had died down, mandatory weekly hours at a combatives and discipline program that Roz Calloway was, with the sudden flood of donations the video had brought to the outreach nonprofit, finally able to build from the ground up. She called it, without any grand ceremony, the Ochoa program, after a 20-year-old private who had died 14 years earlier, believing, for a few terrible seconds, that hesitation meant he was weak. Petey Alvarez showed up on the first morning, looking like he expected to be turned away at the door. Roz put a broom in his hands instead of gloves, and for the first 3 weeks that was all he did. Swept floors, racked mats, refilled water jugs, and listened, from the edges of the room, as a 62-year-old retired command sergeant major taught a rotating class of teenagers and young adults from 3 counties, the same principle she had built her entire career on. Strength is a promise you make to everyone smaller and softer than you. If it isn't that, it isn't strength. It's just a threat wearing strength's clothes. Petey heard those words every week for 3 months before he asked, quietly, after class, if he could try the mat work himself. She said yes. She corrected his stance the same way she'd corrected 600 soldiers before him, patient, exacting, no anger in it anywhere. And over the following year, she watched something in him that she recognized, because she had watched it happen once before, in a field hospital, in a different young man's eyes, a lifetime ago. The slow, unglamorous work of a person deciding, one small choice at a time, that the worst thing they had ever done did not have to be the last thing anyone ever knew about them. 18 months became 2 years, became something that no court order required anymore. Petey finished high school equivalency classes he'd dropped a decade earlier, took a part-time job at the co-op, not the Whitfield co-op, which had changed hands entirely by then, but a new one 2 counties over, and kept showing up to the Ochoa program on Saturday mornings, at first as a student, and then, eventually, as someone the newest and youngest kids in the room were told to go ask if they had a question the older instructors were busy with. He never once, in all that time, called himself anything close to fixed. He would tell you, if you asked him honestly, that he still woke up some mornings hearing the sound of his own laughter in that gravel lot and hating it. But he showed up anyway, every Saturday, and Roz Calloway had learned a long time ago that showing up anyway was the entire definition of the thing people mean when they say someone changed. Roz Calloway still goes to the community garden 3 mornings a week. She still sits on the same bench at the depot sometimes. She still declines the book deals and the talk shows and the documentary crews who show up every few months hoping she's finally changed her mind. What she does not decline, not once, not ever, is a Saturday morning at the Ochoa program, standing in front of a room of teenagers whose hands haven't yet learned what they're capable of, teaching them the one lesson she has spent her whole life trying to prove with her own choices, instead of just her words. 4 young men walked away from that lot with nothing worse than bruises, because I chose, in the middle of the most dangerous 11 seconds of my life, to hold back everything I didn't need. That's not a broken promise. Her voice didn't waver. That's the promise, kept on the one day it was ever actually tested. She turned back toward the mats, toward a room full of young people learning, one patient Saturday at a time, the difference between power and the choice not to use it. And somewhere in that quiet gym, a boy who had once frozen at the edge of a gravel lot with tears on his face was teaching a 12-year-old how to fall safely, how to get back up, and how to hold the line. Because that, in the end, was the whole story. Every time it ever happened, in every park bench and gravel lot and quiet corner of the country where it was still happening somewhere, right now, to someone unshowy enough that the world had decided not to look twice. The quiet ones are not weak. The quiet ones are simply the ones who have already decided what they're willing to become, and are choosing, every single ordinary day, not to become it, until the one day they absolutely have to. Never assume the person the world walked past is nobody. You will not always be told, in advance, when you're wrong. Your next story is already waiting. Choose one of the videos on your screen and keep watching. You won't be disappointed. If you love powerful stories of courage, sacrifice, and justice, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. And before you leave, tell me where you're watching from by dropping your city or country in the comments. I read every comment and love seeing viewers from around the world.